Hey, hi, and hello. Welcome to our February edition of the Talent Table. This session is going to be about New Year, new administrations, leading HR in the time of change. We've got some fabulous guests. I'm super excited to be able to talk to Craig and Vicky and Andrea. But before we do that, we've got a couple of housekeeping things, and then we will get started. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see some widgets that you can use during the event. There's further related reading in the resources section. Feel free to ask questions using the Q&A. We'll have somebody monitoring that. And if we can't get to your question during the webinar, we may answer it after the session ends in a follow-up message, a blog, a LinkedIn post, or maybe another webinar. All right, so I am going to have our speakers introduce themselves in just a second. Rebecca Warren, I am with Eightfold. I have been here a little over 4 years, and I am in our talent-centered transformation group. We focus on helping organizations transform by thinking through the lens of talent rather than the lens of jobs or process. All right, I'm going to kick it on over. We're going to start with Andrea, then we're going to go to Craig, then we're going to go to Vicky, and then I have a question before we actually jump into the whole topic. So, Andrea, go ahead and kick us off. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So I am Andrea Shaw. I'm also with Eightfold. I head up our strategy activities, and a lot of my background, actually, I joined about 3.5 years ago, is actually from the business world. I worked at American Express prior to joining Eightfold for 25 years, mostly in the business, but then I joined HR to lead transformation. I actually had the experience of implementing Eightfold. So really excited. I spend my time working with leaders, helping them understand, what's involved in that process. So excited to join today's conversation. Thanks, Rebecca.
All right. Craig, over to you.
My name is Craig Lean. I'm an attorney at K&L Gates in Washington, D.C. I'm a partner. I lead our OFCCP and affirmative action compliance area, which, we'll probably have to rename. But I do lead it. I co-lead it. And I was the OFCCP director for several years in the first Trump administration. And I was nominated by President Trump to be the Inspector General for the Office of Personnel Management, although they never got to me in the Senate. And then personally, I'm a parent of a daughter who has profound autism with an intellectual disability. And that's informed a lot of my work. I'm a disability advocate, and I serve on a couple boards in DC that are dedicated to advocating for people with disabilities, with the DC government and also with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I do a couple advisory committees, and I focus on those areas. So it's good to be here.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, Vicky.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicky Lipnick. I am currently a partner at Resolution Economics, which is a consulting firm that does a lot of work in the labor and employment space. My background, like Craig, I am an attorney. I work mostly with PhD labor economists now. But prior to being with Resolution Economics, which I joined after my tenure in government service, I served as commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I served 2 terms there. I was appointed acting chair by President Trump in the first Trump administration. I also served as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President George W. Bush. So I have a long tenure in government service and high-level public policy positions. I've always, my specialty is in labor and employment law and civil rights, which I care deeply about. I've been associated with Eightfold for about going on 4 years now. I had been asked to join the advisory board at Eightfold when I left government service. And like Craig, I'm part of the Eightfold Ethics Council. And as I said, spent a lot of my time really interested in, for years and years, the workforce, how people get jobs, how they get jobs that are fulfilling, and are able to sustain their working lives and their family lives, something I care a great deal about, and glad to be with you today.
All right, so we've got some great backgrounds. I think some great conversations coming up. So before we jump into the heart of what we're here to talk about, I have a question for y'all. So which is better, books or movies? And you have to pick. You can't say both. Because I wanted to say both, and I'm like, that's my own question. I can't do that. So you can't say both. Which is better, books or movies? I'll let you decide who wants to start.
Well, you know, people always say when they see a movie that the book was better. So I'll go with books.
Going with books. Okay. Andrew or Vicky, what do you think?
Oh, you're killing me.
It's hard, right?
It's really hard. I think I'm going to have to go with books, though, because, you know, I can take them with me and I can underline things and refer back to things, which I like to do. And I love beautiful writing. And so I think that's such a pleasure, a great pleasure of life when you find that. And so I guess I'll have to go with books.
Books. Okay.
And I guess
Andrea.
I'll be the oddball here, but I'm going to say movies because I think that's the fastest way to get to the story. I know I give up all my creativity in that process, but at least I get to the story. And yeah, that's my response.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. I would have to say books, but I'm gonna go against what I just said. I think books turned into movies. So if I had to only pick one, it would be books. But I love seeing the interpretation that someone else does when they actually put it into movies. So, all right, I love that. It's different ways for us to absorb information, whether it's, and Andrea, it was funny, we were talking about this too, because you were saying that you are a nonfiction reader much more than fiction, which is interesting. We didn't even get into what kind of books. So that's a whole nother topic, but I know I use them for a little bit of escape and, you know, being able to kind of create a picture in my own head. So, all right. So the topic we were talking about, we cannot create anything in our own head. These are things that are changing and changing quickly. So if we think about AI, we think about regulations, lots of things are changing quickly and often, and it's going to have a big impact on businesses and innovation. So we're going to talk about what does that actually mean? We're going to break down what's coming, how new laws could shape AI adoption, what global regulations might look like under new administrations, and why AI is facing more scrutiny. We'll also look at how these changes can play out at both the local and international levels, and most importantly, share practical strategies on how to help you stay ahead of the game. So whether you're navigating compliance or trying to keep up with the latest developments, we've got you covered. So let's jump in. All right, so the first question I want to throw out there, and it's kind of a big open question, and I won't direct it to anybody in particular, let you decide how you might want to respond. But what are some of the biggest challenges that organizations are facing right now, February 13th, in keeping up with changing regulations worldwide? What are those challenges? What's happening?
Well, I guess I'm happy to start. So let's start in the U.S. Right? We have a new administration, and President Trump has been putting out, one executive order after another. Those executive orders give direction to the cabinet agencies, for the most part, to act on the policies that he wants and the policy direction that he wants. So. And that certainly influences the workforce, the workplace, finance, national security. We can go on. And I actually don't expect President Trump's flurry of executive orders to slow down much, at least for, another month, certainly, as it takes time to get the new cabinet in place and then the sub-cabinet officials, and then they can really sort of hit the ground running with the direction that he wants. But in the United States alone, right, there is a lot for any organization, whether you're an employer, private sector, higher education, anyone who's interested in has employees. There's a lot to keep up with, and that in and of itself in the U.S. I think is just on, as we meet today on February 13th, a lot for any organization to have to keep up with and should be paying attention to. I mean, there's a very clear direction that President Trump is setting out, and there's a lot of changes, and that's a lot to keep up with.
Right.
I'll pass off the world to others on the panel.
Well,
But that's what you said is right. That's why I threw the date out there, because if anybody watches this after, who knows what's going to happen in the next couple of months. So I think it's important to say this is a point in time. Over to you, Craig.
I think, so President Trump and the America First Policy Institute, Heritage, all the different think tanks over the 4 years that President Trump was out of power, they prepared. I mean, they put a lot of stuff together. A lot of people have heard about Project 2025, and there's a debate about how much that's being utilized or not. America First did their own policy handbook with lots of policies and goals, and that's the one that's more associated with President Trump himself. And so I agree with Vicki. I think for at least the first 100 days, the typical measuring point for an administration, they'll be rolling things out every day or two. And there's still a lot of things anticipated to come, including related to, in the employment sector, how they approach disparate impact, uniform guidelines, EO1. I think we're going to see guidance on all of those, and we may see significant disruptive changes on all of those as well. So I think you're going to continue to see a lot in the employment sector. On artificial intelligence, I think we're already beginning to see a different approach in the Biden administration, one that's less focused on regulation, more focused on competition with China and Europe. And, with the vice president going to the Paris AI summit and basically sort of throwing down the gauntlet. I was saying basically that this is almost like a space race. Like we're going to the moon, we're going to Mars. We're all in on AI. We're going to compete. Europe, you're going to fall behind. I mean, that's basically what he said because of your precautionary principle and all these concerns that you have. And we want to be the leader on that technology. And with DeepSeek with China, I mean, that's a real issue right now. I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of American companies. So I think you may see less regulation. Also, President Trump issued an executive order that was, in other times, would be quite startling. In this one, I think it was missed because there were so many other EOs. But he basically said that he was going to do 10 deregulatory actions for every regulatory one. He's going to eliminate 10 regulations for every new regulation. 10-to-1 ratio is never, it used to be 2-to-1. And it was hard to meet that. 10-to-1, basically tells me we're not going to be seeing any regulatory actions at all, or very few. We're going to be seeing a lot of deregulatory actions. So, and then with Europe in particular, I think you're going to see pushback too. I think UK may go a different route than the rest of Europe on AI regulation. I think Europe's going to have to respond, or a lot of I think they're going to fall way behind on AI.
Yeah. And then if I could just really quickly, I think if you then take a look at the governing bodies and councils and organizations, with all these changes, they're going to need to take a moment. They're going to need to understand it. They're going to need to turn to subject matter experts like Vicki and Craig, understand the interpretation of those laws, understand what's happening internally, how it impacts their internal, what is the company's position. So with all of these pivots, it's going to take some time for internal governing bodies and councils to really digest this. And I think the challenges for leaders will be, waiting for that determination. That could potentially cause some pause in the short term. But obviously, as Craig's sharing, that the direction is to kind of lessen the regulations. But once kind of that's digested, then hopefully organizations will be able to take the actions that they're needing to take for the business.
Yeah, and I think all of you have made really good points, and that idea of the US versus the rest of the world, there's implications throughout all pieces. And so how do complex organizations that are global have to look at things differently based on where they're at? And what you said, Andrea, too, about there may be some pauses, right? There may be some things that we say, hey, we have guidance here but not here, or we're going to do this here but not there. So it'll be interesting to see how folks, if they decide to do a peanut butter approach, or if they're going to wait and do pieces as the advice comes down. So okay. So and Vicki, maybe we'll start with you here. Are there key industries or sectors that you think are going to be impacted more significantly by some of these upcoming regulations?
And let's say, again, regulations or not regulations, right? Deregulatory, right?
Great point. That's right.
Right. Or as Craig said, right, a reversal of some regulations or pulling back. Well,
Right.
certainly, broadly in the tech world, there definitely will be, I think there will be impacts there. But of course, tech applies everywhere today, right? It applies across the economy in every sector, right? The auto industry, trucking, the human resources world, right? I mean, how you hire employees. So tech is everywhere. And so that will, whatever the approach is in terms of deregulation will impact across the economy. I certainly think the defense industry, national security, there's a lot of implications there. And that is by no means my field there, but certainly there are a lot of issues there that will be dealt with. And then the other thing is in terms of finance. And one thing I wanted to mention also from our discussion a minute ago about how many executive orders and things that the president has been issuing. Another one that I think hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention, but I think really applies in the tech world is the president issued an executive order and ordered and asked the Treasury Department and the head of OMB to come up with a plan for a sovereign wealth fund for the United States, which the tech industry in particular is interested in for financing purposes, right? Global financing purposes, and how that can be applied. So I think that's something that also is on the horizon. And then again, sort of in the talent world, in the HR world, the degree to which, as Craig pointed out, we will see potentially some changes in the longstanding approaches to concerns in the workplace, right? In particular, my expertise in the discrimination world, we're obviously seeing a lot of interest there and concern on the president's part in terms of DEI, and I know we'll probably talk about this more, but how that plays out in terms of what has been sort of traditional approaches in evaluating workplaces and who succeeds in a workplace and who doesn't. I think that's something to watch for as well.
Yeah,
and
fair.
I think that's absolutely correct what Vicki said. This is going to be a good time for AI and HR. And for those listening, I would, if you're not already using it, I would take a strong look at it because, the benefit, one, the administration is pro-technology. It wasn't the first Trump administration. Two, I suspect it'll be even more so in this one. Very pro-technology, the president's management agenda throughout the whole first term was focused on bringing in new technologies that could make things more efficient. I wouldn't be surprised if down the line you see the US in its hiring using artificial intelligence itself. The benefit of using artificial intelligence in hiring is that it is very merit focused, it's skill focused. So, and it's objective, at least to, people debate that, but if you're using a really good AI provider, they will be able to tell you what are the factors that are being considered and how you're applying those weights, which is very helpful in being able to show that you didn't have disparate treatment. You're not intentionally treating people differently. And then even from a disparate impact standpoint, it's helpful because you can show that the factors you're considering are reasonable factors that are job related And likewise, you could likely validate those factors or what you're using so that you could satisfy the uniform guidelines, assuming those continue to apply, but you can satisfy the legal standards that are applicable. And because I think you're going to see less of a focus on some of the civil rights requirements that have been, that were a big focus of the Biden administration. They were very attuned and focused on algorithmic bias and adverse impact. I think you're going to see less of that in this administration, as long as you can show that the benefits of the AI outweigh the costs of the AI. I think it's going to be a much more cost-benefit analysis type approach with less of a concern about impacts. I think that's what you're going to see in the long run. So, and then also you have this big focus on AI generally and technology and competing with, China and Europe. So I think you're going to see a lot more investment in the sector too. So it's probably going to be a very good time for artificial intelligence. I think you're going to see a lot of technological advances over the next 4 years.
Yeah, with that 10-to-1 ratio, it seems like there's going to be maybe a lot more doors opening or areas that we might be popping into that we haven't in the past. All right. Andrea, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great description of kind of what's happening. I still believe that companies are going to take steps and actions to self-monitor themselves, right? Because there's too much at risk for their brands if there's an outcome of bias, if there's an outcome of discrimination. So even with fewer regulatory requirements out there, I do think companies will step in and take the right actions, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and I should add, and I'm sure both Vicki and Andrea would, you still have the states and the localities, and you still need to be careful. And, the argument that you're doing merit-based actions doesn't work if you're using a platform that has significant algorithmic bias and doesn't even satisfy the 4/5 rule, for example. That it's very hard to argue that you're doing a merit-based activity then. Instead, you're doing a biased activity that is likely undermining a merit selection process. So I'm not saying you shouldn't continue a focus, and you should work with AI platforms that care about civil rights, that have an AI ethics council like Vicki and I serve on, or an advisory board like Andrea leads, and supervises, and both Vicki and I serve on. So you should definitely look for those things. What I'm saying though is that some of the the sort of precautionary principle that you see more in Europe, where, well, even though we think it's safe to use AI, we're not necessarily going to do it because we want to wait to see what. I think a lot of that's going to go away. I think you're going to see tremendous growth in the sector. So this is a good time to take a look at AI if you haven't before.
Okay. Yeah. So, and y'all have alluded to this or talked about it a little bit. I think the piece that a lot of folks in the HR space have questions on, right? What is this going to do to the labor market and hiring trends? How are we going to look at the implications to the workforce, right? Not just employees, but what does that look like for the entire labor market? So how are we thinking about, Craig, as you said, that skills-based, that merits-based, which a lot of companies already do, right? We already have that as that foundation of let's put the right person in there and let's look at the skills that they have as opposed to looking at a background or, certifications. But how do we think this might affect, especially like HR leaders with different opinions on how things are going to happen? I think there could be some challenges across the space where different companies are interpreting things differently, and with less regulation, that could be interesting. So what are your thoughts on the labor market, hiring trends, and things that could be affected by some of these changes? So Craig, do you want to take a stab at that one first?
Well, I think it's going to be incredibly disruptive, maybe in a positive way, but I think you're going to see. And to me, the benefit of artificial intelligence, when it's not constrained so much, is that it actually can be used to identify underrepresented groups. Much more, there was an interesting study I saw even with all the concerns that were out there about civil rights and artificial intelligence, there was the study I saw that, and I've seen it a few times, this number, that if you asked minority candidates, more would prefer to be evaluated by artificial intelligence than a person. And it was because even with all the concerns, because of the concern about unconscious bias and because of the concern that people lie about what they're considering, people don't even know what they're considering sometimes. And that, with the knowing that the average person spends 7 seconds looking at a resume. I've heard 3 seconds. I don't know how you look at something for 3 seconds, but 3 seconds, 5, 7. And you're like basically looking at what school they went to. Oh, that's my school. Pass them along. Let's talk to them. Or, oh, they went to an Ivy League school. Let's talk to them. Or, oh, they run. They're a runner and they play chess just like me. Let's talk to them. And hopefully they look at where they worked too. But to really do a comprehensive evaluation of what skills they might have and pick someone based on merit, you can't do that in 7 seconds. I'm sorry, you just can't. So, but a machine can. A machine can. An AI can. It can actually do a full evaluation in just a few seconds. So I would much rather I think most people would rather have some combination of AI and human so that they know at the very least that their resume got looked at in a comprehensive way. Now, would they prefer it be done by something that doesn't have bias? Yes, of course. But they prefer it be done at all. I mean, I think that's one of the concerns people have when you hear, oh, there's 2,000 resumes. What have they done? What data management techniques have they used? Was I even considered? I don't know someone. You always hear that. It's who you know. You still hear that in a lot of these jobs. And, AI gives us the opportunity not to decide based on who you know in a much more comprehensive way.
Right. At least serve up the candidates for the human then to evaluate from a different perspective. Yeah. Okay.
And Rebecca, I have a just strong opinion about, obviously, about AI. But I think ultimately you asked the impact on the workforce. I think it's a very positive impact on the workforce because ultimately, if you look at AI, as Craig was describing, it's intended to help individuals and workers find roles that best match their skills, right? So you don't have to be dependent on knowing somebody. You don't have to be dependent on only being able to understand one organization. It really opens up the opportunities. And so I think in an environment where the regulations are looser and AI adoption is encouraged, I think that's a positive thing for the workforce experience. As a matter of fact, I feel like when I was looking for kind of the approvals with the workers' councils in Europe, for example, on implementing AI, I had very positive reactions, right? Which is very different than oftentimes when you're driving change. And that was because the experience was going to be improved, meaning employees or workers could be tapped on the shoulder when there's a role that opens up that they're interested in. They can opt for that. Like all those things make the experience better and easier. So unusually, I had a positive response from the Workers' Council for the new technology. So, and that underscores what AI's impact is for workers, right? It's really intended to help them in their mobility, in their finding jobs, and even in their learning and development. So I think positive things that will happen for the workforce with this.
And
I guess,
Vicki, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of points. So your question is broadly about the workforce and the impacts on the workforce. So I would sort of divide it into two things. So first is, as we discussed, there is the finding talent, right? So that is the current need. You hear it from employers everywhere, right? We've got an unemployment rate of 4%. Job growth has been very good over the past few years, and employers need workers. I hear it everywhere, and they really, are looking for skills. So it's a combination of both. They need bodies, but they need, people who can do the jobs that they need, even with the extraordinary training programs that many employers have put in place. So to the extent that AI can really facilitate that process, and I think that it does in the employment space, HR space, talent management, finding those skills-based things, as was discussed here. As Craig said, if you're not using AI, you're probably, as a company, might start to fall behind, right? Because you are really looking for those workers. And then I think the other aspect that we hear a lot about and gets talked about a lot in terms of the use of AI, and this is across the board, not just for hiring, but the issue about it's going to be such a disruptive force. Is it going to displace people, right? It's a technology, right? So the entire history of labor and employment, right, is technologies develop and people move into different kinds of activities in different jobs. And so that's the other concern that is raised related to AI. How displacing will it be for traditional, what we think of people in the workforce now? And you have to really think broadly, right, in terms of how people, all the kinds of jobs in the workplace and all the kinds of jobs that we need to sustain and advance society, right? So from lower skilled jobs to super high skilled jobs. Mm-hmm. And, it has historically always been the case. If you go back 30 years and think about the beginnings of the internet, right? And there was a lot of concern that how many people were going to be displaced by the internet in their jobs. And, that turned out not to be the case, right? People move into different things. So we certainly will see that. But I think we are just really at the beginnings of that, right? In terms of, well, how will AI transform the jobs that people do and how people go about their jobs? But I don't think it's something to fear. I think it's something that, will most likely, just as the internet did, enhance the standard of living for people. But we have to, create the environment where that is able to happen. But there's always disruptions. There are always disruptions that are caused by technology. And so that's something that we certainly have to be mindful of in terms of the workforce.
Yeah, agree. And Vicki, one thing I wanted to throw back to you as well is in our conversations when we were talking about this is there's still that safety net for employees, right? There's still civil rights laws that are in place. There are still protections. So would you talk about that just for a second about what protections are still there, even if some of these things are being deregulated?
Right. So, and even Craig mentioned this earlier. So we have very fundamental, long-standing civil rights protections, both at the federal level and at the state level, but in particular at the federal level. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is really one of the great laws of the country and offers protections for individuals in employment, not just in employment, it's beyond that, housing and other things, but, based on race, sex, national origin, religion. The EEOC is the primary enforcer of that law, the Justice Department as well for public employers. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is not going away. And, the EEOC, and in addition to that, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as Craig is a big proponent of and advocate for, that is not going away. These are deeply regarded federal anti-discrimination laws. And I would point out that even in, I know that as people have read about President Trump's executive orders and the ones that in particular have focused on, we don't want to see illegal DEI, and you can put illegal and DEI in quotes, but they also make the point of, we want to see our civil rights laws enforced. We want to, we want employers to adhere to our civil rights protections. So those are still there. Again, there are also those at the state level, and Congress is not going to change those or pull those back. Those are ingrained in not just our jurisprudence, but they are ingrained in society and our expectations as citizens in this country of how we expect to be treated in this country, in our work and when we go to work. And I do not see any kind of pullback on that. There might be some, as you know, the disparate impact, as Craig was mentioning earlier, one of the theories under the Civil Rights Act. But I don't see any lack of regard for the civil rights protections.
If anything, they might be brought up more in some ways. For federal contractors, you had some of a defense that you could say, well, we're doing affirmative action, so we're race conscious in terms of, not in the selection itself, but in terms of our outreach and recruitment, assessing our workforce. There's always been a little bit of a concern that if you have placement goals, could a company put their thumb on the scale a little bit to try to achieve those? Would that be detectable? Could the company would probably not admit to that. So the point is, there was that concern. I think now anything that's race conscious or gender conscious is going to receive scrutiny. So, and there's always been that tension, I'd say, between the right and the left, Republicans and Democrats. The Republican vision of civil rights was always more sort of the colorblind approach, equality of opportunity. And I am a Republican, so I don't want to necessarily say I don't want to speak for the Democratic Party, but I always assessed on the Democratic side, there was a little bit more openness to equality of outcome or equity in outcomes. I think that you've seen that from the left a little bit, that equality of opportunity doesn't get us far enough in addressing historic inequities. And I do think that was the Biden administration approach with DEIA to an extent. And so there's some tension between those two views.
Yeah.
And at this point, President Trump is the president, and he's definitely come down on the side of the more historical conservative or Republican view in that. And so companies should just be, and he's willing to use executive power to try to achieve it. So I would just be very careful in your approach and definitely try to be strategic and thoughtful, nonpartisan, really go in there and look at it and say, what's in the best interest of our organization and our employees? You absolutely should recognize that there are historic inequities and discrimination that's still there. And at the same time, that might decrease opportunity for certain groups. You need to make sure that they're getting equal opportunity. That's really important under either approach. So that you need to do. Where you need to be very careful is if you have programs, particularly ones that are like pipeline programs, mentorship programs, affinity groups, which are only open to certain groups and might provide some sort of advantage based on race or gender. Even if that advantage you might be able to justify by historic inequity, what this administration is saying is, that justification isn't sufficient to make it legal. And you have this recent Muldrow decision from the Supreme Court, which says that even small changes, not necessarily material ones, small differences in treatment based on race or gender can be sufficient potentially to bring a Title VII claim. So, in that respect, you have to be very careful. And I would, at this point, I would focus on making sure you don't have discrimination against any group, including men, including white employees. Treat them the same as every other group. No discrimination. No discrimination is allowed. We want equal opportunity for everyone. We welcome everyone. And I'm not being naive here. I understand that you're still going to see more discrimination against women and minorities because historically we've seen that. But you do occasionally see discrimination against white employees and men, and that discrimination is equally as wrong. We don't tolerate any discrimination. That's really what I think employers need to.
And Craig, if I could just jump in, I think your point earlier that you were talking about is focus on merit, right?
Yes.
That's ultimately
merit.
kind of a theme that crosses the bridge across hopefully both sides. But you focus on merit. That's the kind of the foundational way to approach looking at talent, right?
Absolutely. And I would just say with that, even when you talk about merit, there's different views on that from the right and the left about, and I've seen this in the DEI community, concerns, well, merit doesn't fully recognize that there's been a lack of opportunity to obtain certain experiences that lend itself to a merit
Yeah.
evaluation. And there's truth to that. I just want to be clear. There's truth to that. At the same time, when you're dealing with federal dollars, like as a federal contractor or a federal fund recipient, or when you're just as an employer complying with Title VII, you still in the end need to make the decision based on merit. It doesn't mean that you don't need to try to, this is why I like, for example, Eightfold or AI, maybe looking at the traditional, well, who went to an Ivy League school, in some ways that's going to benefit the establishment or entrenched groups who have more access to wealth. Actually, using AI will give more opportunity, hopefully, to those who have been overlooked or underrepresented in the past, because they may have developed skills from other sources that, those who are more affluent, you might take for granted. But it's important that you're really evaluating the whole person to give more opportunities to people with disabilities, to minorities, to women who may not have had the same opportunities as someone who's more affluent or who's a white employee or a male employee. At the same time, and I'm saying a lot here, one thing I know the administration would say is, but don't assume that all white employees have gotten all these opportunities. You have a white working class, you have our vice president who's from Appalachia and who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, making the point, well, affluence and socioeconomic status are important too, to consider that.
Yeah, we could probably take the whole, this is a very deep.
I know, I was just going to say, this is great. Well, so let's take that though to the next step, right? So when we think about the legal landscape and we think about what that does for organizations, right? So we've talked about kind of in general, we've talked about workforce. Now, if we think about from a structure perspective, right? How should organizations be structuring their governance policies in general to align with both current and future frameworks, right? We, Craig, you had said the next, 2 months are going to be really important. Vicki, you said the same thing. We're going to see a lot of things coming. How should organizations be thinking about that from a compliance standpoint now, but also how do you prepare for the future? And I don't know, Vicki, if you want to throw your thoughts on that one.
Sure. And I'll start just picking up sort of where we were leaving off there on the last discussion, which is to say that to the extent that, there's the reporting about the president's executive orders, and I'll call it sort of the anti-DEI, anti-woke, right, rhetoric. And those executive orders are not a license to ignore the Civil Rights Act and ignore the civil rights laws and to start discriminating in your workplace. It doesn't mean that you can do that by any means. And again, there is language in the executive orders that is pretty clear about that. So I just want to make sure that folks understand that. That by no means is, well, we can hire whoever we want without regard to the protections that are afforded by the Civil Rights Act. So that's something to be mindful of. In terms of governance structures, and I think this is again, as you said, sort of not just in the employment context, but for any kind of use of AI, and certainly, I know Eightfold has this, but any kind of companies that are thinking about using AI or are AI providers, that those internal controls and internal governance councils are incredibly important, and making sure that that there is an understanding about bias, right? So it's not just bias in the traditional sense, right? But is there some kind of bias in the data? That, it's not just about race and gender, but there can be other things, right? And so having those kind of internal controls in place where there is a good understanding of, if you are a company that is using AI, like Andrea was for many years, and understanding, okay, what are we using it for? And what are the outcomes that we're hoping to get out of it, and having the governance structure in place, the right people. Certainly it includes your legal counsel, but people who are experts in terms of how the data is used, what's going into it. I think it's incredibly important. even more so now, the more there is a lighter touch, right, on the regulatory front. Just to take a step back, there are no, even under President Biden, President Biden had a couple executive orders related to AI and had directed cabinet agencies to put out principles, but there's still no federal regulation about AI. There's certainly a lot of guardrails, and I think even in particular, the National Institute of Science and Technology, right, they're much more technical guardrails and guidance that they have put out still stands. And I think that is probably still really important guidance for any developer to be paying attention to and any user of AI. So following those principles and having governance in place, I think there's still a consumer aspect, right? So even if there is a lighter regulatory touch, there is a consumer awareness of, well, what is this AI? What does it mean, right? And I think companies want to be mindful of that for their own reputations. And then in addition to that, there will be legal cases that will challenge AI. I mean, I was just hearing about one this morning that had to do with staffing in a medical setting. And, that there was some algorithmic bias, right, related to the staffing levels. I think there's a much greater awareness, certainly in terms of the legal bar about where there are maybe AI that does have a disproportionate impact in a harmful way, whether it's some kind of, consumer protection. So beyond the employment space, and that will still be there. And that's even more reason for companies who are both developers and users to have their governance in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm watching the time. And I know, Craig, I'll let you pop in on that one. And then I do want to switch to talk about strategies for leaders. So Craig, give me your 30 seconds on this one, and then I want to be able to switch.
Yeah, so I think I would take a hard look at AI right now. I think it's a good opportunity to both meet civil rights requirements, which continue to exist, and also be able to show merit-based decision-making. One thing that AI can offer, for example, I know Eightfold offers this, is they can mask identity, like they can mask your race or your gender and allow a true evaluation of your skills without that being considered. That's an important civil rights requirement. It allows you to audit in real time. It allows you to assess whether you're having a disparate impact based on race or gender. You should absolutely, and I want to be very clear, you should be strongly committed to civil rights, no matter what the enforcement posture of a particular administration is. You want the best product. You want that product picking people based on skills. There is significant risk if your product is shown to have significant material algorithmic bias. You're looking at potential lawsuits from the plaintiff's bar. You're looking at the EOC is going to be interested in that. DOJ may now be interested in that under the False Claims Act, because you may be certifying that you're in compliance with Title VII, subject to pain of the False Claims Act, and yet it then gets reported that you have biased decision making. So you still want to go to those AI providers that are complying with the New York AI law, that are complying with Colorado's AI law, that are complying with the uniform guidelines, and have a page dedicated to that. That's what Vicki and I do on the AI Ethics Council, is we raise these issues and try to make sure that Eightfold's complying with them. And you need to comply with that no matter what the posture of the administration is. So I just want to be very clear about that.
So thank you. And this is fascinating. Like, I wish we had another hour, because there's so many more things that I think y'all could share. I think this has been great. I do want to try to switch to leave just a couple of thoughts for HR leaders. And so would love to get your feedback on all of this information, right? There's a lot happening. There's a lot of things that we need to be paying attention to. Things are shifting. Some things are opening up. Some things might become a little bit more restrictive. So for HR leaders, as we think about folks in that space, what are some things that you would recommend that they should be taking into consideration to prepare for upcoming regulations? How should they be thinking about communicating to their teams, right? To me, that's just something that's so important, is that transparent communication about what's happening, what's not happening, what's changing, as Vicki, as you're saying, what's not changing, right? So I would love just to hear from you in general about what are some steps that HR leaders should be taking to prepare for some of these changes and making sure that they're communicating to their workforce.
Yeah. So I'll just share a couple of things I think are really important. One, with regards to the communication, I mean, as I said earlier, I think companies will have to take the lead on doing the right things and make sure they don't have bias in their activities. And I think leaders should communicate that commitment, that continued commitment to their organization. I think the other thing, I know, Vicki, you were saying earlier, involve your legal counsel or your compliance counsel, whatever counsel you have, your AI counsel. I know lots of organizations have different counsels. Involve them. If you're leading a transformation, you're leading entry into an AI solution, involve them and involve them early, right? If they understand what your business objectives are, what you're trying to accomplish, whatever changes in the regulatory environment, they can think about how to manage through that and minimize the risks, right? Have them there to help you solve for the business objective in a way that manages the risk. So I would say involve them early. Don't involve them at the very end to get the stamp of approval. Involve them early and allow them to help you solve for the problem that you're solving for. So that would be my biggest recommendation.
I completely agree. For HR leaders in particular, and be joined at the hip with your legal counsel, whether it's in-house counsel or outside counsel, and make sure that you have some inventory of how are you using AI, because in some way it's probably going to affect your workforce, right? So it may not just be about acquiring talent, right? But you may be using it somehow internally for promotional purposes. It may have some aspects for training purposes, and maybe you actually want to train people, right? You have a group of people who you need to help them develop some AI skills. And of course, we haven't even talked about the use of AI, right, for particular jobs, right? So for, if people are using ChatGPT or, those kinds of things, you have to have some kind of internal watch and governance about what are the expectations about the use of AI for the particular jobs that you have. That's a whole nother aspect as well.
A whole other webinar.
We'll come back to you for that one.
Yeah.
But it is and for, I will say, for HR leaders in particular, because I would, again, there is no federal regulation about AI. Congress has not been, able to craft how they want to go about AI regulation. Maybe that will happen. I would expect that that's probably a slower process now with the new Congress. But there will continue to be activity at the state and local level. And so just like HR leaders have to pay attention to what are the family leave laws in 50 different states, they will have to pay attention to what are the AI laws in 50 different states. And importantly, that will implicate privacy issues too. So most of the states have, or many states have, privacy laws. And that's something that, in conjunction with just the flat out regulation of AI at the state level, they should be paying attention to what are the privacy laws as well.
It's a good call out.
I would just add, I think it's important for organizations to be very open to AI. I'll just give you an example. I'm a law professor at George Washington. This year we were able to put on our syllabus, how open are we to AI? I took the most open view. I told my students, I want you to use AI in putting together your papers. Now, if you're going to quote AI, I want you to let me know. And that may not be the best quote, but it might not be the best site. You still want to use traditional sources too. But absolutely, you should be engaging with the AI. It may see things that you haven't seen. And that's the way it's going to be. It's like when we had calculators and you don't use a calculator, or when we had the internet and you don't use the internet. You're not helping your client. You're not doing a service to your client. Your clients are going to be looking at ChatGPT, so you should too. And the same with AI and employment decisions, AI and everything. My recommendation is so that you don't fall behind, that you have your legal counsel office be open to AI. You tell them, look, we're open to AI. We want to know the risks, but we're willing to take some. We just want to make sure that we're mitigating the risk and that you take this proactive view, or else you're going to fall behind as an organization. And you don't want that. This is a good time to take another look at AI, lean into AI, put in the safeguards you need, but don't put the head in the sand. Don't do that. It's because you'll just fall behind. And honestly, the legal risks will still be there, because I think someone put in the chat, humans are biased too, and probably more biased than AI a lot of time. So, and they don't even know it all the time. Everyone loves to say that they're not biased. That's why they have unconscious bias training. So the point is, at least with the AI, you can evaluate that, detect it, audit it. You know what factors you're putting in there. I think that's the way that you're going to see employment go. It's going to be more helpful to have the AI than not have the AI. I like to say that about, I used to be a local government attorney, and we would always talk about autonomous vehicles. And people would be like, oh, well, those autonomous vehicles, what if they get in an accident? I'd be like, well, yeah, people get in accidents too. And yeah, that's not a good thing, obviously. We got to reduce that. But in 20 years, you're going to tell me which is more likely to get in an accident? It's going to be you, not the autonomous vehicle. And
right.
In fact, it's going to be malpractice to drive. Like you're going to be taking on a lot of risks. You're going to have to get special insurance. It's the same in the employment sector. AI is going to keep improving. It's going to eliminate the bias over time. It's going to pick the most skilled person, probably better than people 9 out of 10 times. So it's just something we have to be aware of and prepare for and embrace.
Yeah, and I think that's great, because I think all of the things that we've talked about, and I'm going to go back to y'all just for one last little tidbit, but I think the themes that we're coming away with, right, are transparency, awareness, paying attention, thinking through all of the pieces ahead of time, right? And so I think that understanding, that awareness of what's coming, where we're going, where we're headed, and really being aware of things that could impact your business. I think all of these things that you've shared are great. One question that someone did have is there a source of info that you recommend folks look to find the most recent and accurate information? So I don't know if y'all have that now. If not, send it to us and we'll send it out to the group. Because I think that's one of the things that's confusing, is where do I look for the right answers or the places that are going to give me the most accurate information? So any thoughts on that, where folks should look for accurate and up-to-date information? Oh, y'all are laughing.
Yeah, right. There's a lot. Right. Again, you do have to pay attention to what's happening in every state. And, a lot of law firms like Craig's firm, for example, will, have good sources and keep up to all of that. I do think people should pay attention to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their website. And because that, again, I don't think the guardrails that they've kind of set out there, they tend to be more technical, but I think that's an important source for folks to
Thank you.
be aware of.
I would, my recommendation is to be very careful. I don't know if there's a really good place to look. Even I would typically say the EOC website, but the acting chair has indicated a lot of that guidance is out of date, and some of it's going to be changed, and it may not be reflective of current policy or practice of the EOC. So I would be careful. I would talk to counsel. I would talk to your outside counsel. They may have to make something bespoke for you, because it's a lot of these regulations are changing, and it's true. Even though Title VII and Title VI haven't changed, having a different administration approach to those, using the False Claims Act, having DOJ involved, taking an aggressive view, which they are on DEI. That changes the risk calculus a little bit. It doesn't necessarily change the law, but it changes their enforcement priorities. So in that sense, keeping up to date with the EEOs and also any court proceedings related to the EEOs is really important. But that's why, you probably need to go to lawyers because it's hard to, there's not one website that's, and a lot of times they have their own perspective, maybe a more liberal perspective or a more conservative perspective. You really want a neutral perspective, to the extent you can get one that's strategic and is telling you what's the best thing to do during changing times. That's really important, that you're, you know, doing what's in the best interest of your organization during changing times.
All right. We are at time. So I'm just going to ask you, give me 20 seconds of an answer, this final question. If folks walk away from this webinar doing one thing, what do you want it to be? Give me that one action item, that one thing that they should be doing. And I think maybe you've already said it, but let's just encapsulate it as we close out the webinar. Andrew, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the one thing is learn. Keep learning, learn about what AI can do for your workforce, learn about the regulatory environment and what it's trying to accomplish for the workforce. I think there's a lot of overlap between the two. And if you can understand that, then you can navigate your way to help your company.
Love it. Craig, what do you think?
Well, I was going to say embrace AI because I think that it's the time of AI. I think you're going to see that over the next decade. But even more important than that, for all of you and for your employees, I would say be pragmatic and strategic in looking at everything happening and try to put aside your feelings about it. I know that people feel very strongly on these topics. There's a lot of risk out there. There's a lot of opportunity. You got to figure out what's in the best interest of your organization.
All right, Vicki, bring us home.
I was going to say, to go back to your very first question, you could always watch a movie about AI. I'm just kidding.
Let's do that. I love that. Read your books and your movies. Watch your
Exactly.
movies.
Read your books and watch a movie. And, you know, I'm sure there are some, you know, good AI. There are definitely some good AI created movies, right? So you could do that. I agree with both Andrea and Craig, and especially for your organization, really, you know, figure out, well, where can it be advantageous to you, right? And use it, and then, but make sure you have a good governance structure in place and that you are aware of those risks. And, you know, I mean, that's just balancing risk as you do in any kind of new changing technology and how you're adopting it, and make sure you have the right training in place for your employees who are using it. But don't be afraid of it. I mean, it is here and it can be helpful.
All right. Thank you all. This was fascinating. We could go longer, but we can't. I'm getting the get off the stage here. So thank you so much for the time, the effort, the knowledge. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned, audience, for our talent table coming up in March. More information coming on that soon. All right. Have a great day, all.